What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I was never being generous. I was being tolerated. And the moment I finally understood that, something in me shifted forever. For years, and I mean literally every holiday for as long as I can remember since I started earning enough to be considered comfortable, I was the one who picked up the check at Christmas dinner. It was never something I announced, I just did it, because I thought it was easier than listening to people bicker about splitting the bill, or watching relatives dig through purses for cards they swore they had but somehow never managed to pull out. At first, I told myself I was doing it because it kept the peace, and in the beginning, I even convinced myself that it bought me a kind of respect, that maybe my family looked at me as dependable, successful, and someone they could rely on when things got complicated. But here's the brutal part. I found out they never respected me at all. They only saw me as a resource to be tapped. Whenever the check came, and realizing that was like having the rug yanked out from under my entire sense of belonging in that family. Last Christmas, everything played out exactly as it always did. We sat down at the restaurant that my mom picked, the kind of place that tries to look cozy but charges $20 for sides and $30 for wine you could buy at the grocery store. My cousins ordered appetizers without asking, my uncle added extra cocktails to the tab, and the kids were allowed to order desserts that ended up mostly half-eaten and pushed away. I didn't say anything, because why would I? This was our script, and I had been playing my part for years. But then it happened. While the server was refilling water glasses and I was sitting quietly, I heard my Aunt Denise lean across the table and whisper to my mom, not knowing I caught every word. "Don't worry, he's just our ATM. He'll cover it like always." She said it casually, with a little laugh, the same way someone might comment about a parking meter or a vending machine, not even realizing she was summarizing exactly how they had all seen me all these years. I sat there with a smile frozen on my face, because if I let myself react in that moment, I think I would have said something I couldn't take back. The meal dragged on, courses came and went, and all the while I was replaying those words in my head, just our ATM. That wasn't a slip, that wasn't a misunderstanding, that was the truth leaking out in its purest form. Suddenly, all those years of so-called gratitude, all the "thank you, you're so generous," all the pats on the back and the winks about me being the successful one collapsed into nothing, because I realized that none of it was respect. It was entitlement dressed up as flattery. And when I finally understood that, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time, I wasn't angry, I wasn't embarrassed, I wasn't even sad. I just knew the game had to end, and it had to end right there in that moment, with the check that was about to land in the middle of the table like it always did. So when the server, Janelle, came over with the little black folder and set it down in front of me without even asking, because that's how automatic it had become, every eye turned to me with the same quiet expectation as always. I looked around that table, at my aunt already reaching for her coat, at my uncle signaling the kids to get their shoes back on, at my cousin scrolling on her phone, none of them making the slightest move toward responsibility. And that's when I smiled, pushed the folder gently back to the center of the table, and said, "Not tonight. Your turn." You could have heard a pin drop. At first, they thought I was joking. My uncle laughed nervously, made some comment about me being funny tonight, and my mom gave me the look, the one that says, "Don't make a scene." But I didn't flinch. I waved Janelle back over and, in the calmest voice I could manage, said, "Separate checks, please." "Thank you." She nodded immediately, and I could see the faintest flicker of a smile on her face, the kind that says, "Good for you." My Aunt Denise froze, my cousin Bree made a big show of digging through her bag, and my mom whispered, "Are you sure?" like I was committing some sort of crime against the family. But here's the thing, I was sure. More sure than I had been about anything in a long time. I wasn't doing this to embarrass them, I wasn't doing it to make a statement, I was doing it because I finally understood that the only way to end this pattern was to stop playing along. Bree pulled out her card reluctantly, my uncle grumbled about how he forgot his wallet, but eventually found it in his jacket, and my aunt tried to mutter something about fixing this at home. That was the exact phrase she used, like I was a child acting out in public. And maybe that's what they thought, that I was having a tantrum. But in reality, it was the opposite. I was being clearer, calmer, and stronger than I had ever been at that table. The funniest part was watching their faces when the bills came back individually. My uncle complained that his was too high because he hadn't realized how much those cocktails added up. Bree said it was unfair that dessert wasn't split, even though she barely touched hers. And Antonice? Her card got declined the first time she tried it. She laughed nervously, said it was just a glitch, and handed over another one, but I saw the look in her eyes, the sudden flicker of panic. For once, the burden wasn't mine to carry, and the weight that rolled off my shoulders in that moment was indescribable. I left that dinner without paying a dime, and as I walked out, I felt a mix of adrenaline and peace. They didn't know it yet, but everything had just changed, and the roles we had all been playing for years were never going to be the same again. Because once you stop being someone's ATM, you stop being their safety net, their scapegoat, and their silent provider all at once. And when you do that, you find out very quickly who actually values you and who only values what you give them. That night, I lay in bed replaying the entire dinner in my head, from the moment I heard the whisper to the look on Antonice's face when the server handed her back the declined card. I knew this was only the beginning, and I also knew they weren't going to let it go quietly. And that was fine with me because I wasn't going back. Do you want to know what happened the very next morning? The group chat lit up like a firestorm. By the time the morning light pushed through the blackout curtains and I reached for my phone with that tiny knot already forming under my ribs because I knew they would not sleep on this, the family thread had already erupted into what looked like a courtroom without rules. A pile of overlapping bubbles where Bree was performing a breathless monologue about humiliation and tradition, and how I had chosen the absolute worst moment to make a point, while Aunt Denise, who always pretends she hates drama but somehow acts as its booking agent, was sprinkling little jabs about respect and gratitude, and how I had apparently promised to handle the bill because that is what you always do. Which is a neat way of rewriting history into a story that suits the person telling it and a reliable sign that someone is terrified the pattern they depend on is finally cracking in public view. I lay there for a minute, not answering, letting the waves run until they ran out of steam, because I have learned that the loudest people talk themselves into reveals if you just give them space, and sure enough, after a dozen long messages, there it was in plain text, the quiet truth Aunt Denise thinks only whispers can carry. Typed out by Bree with that righteous energy she loves to weaponize. You do well for yourself. You always step up. It is not a big deal for you. You know some of us are struggling. Why make a scene over one dinner? And besides, you usually buy nicer things for yourself. Anyway, so what is the difference? Which, to me, translated into one very clean sentence that needed no emoji and no decoration, only a decision on my end about what I would do with it. I told myself I would answer once, in my own voice, without venom, without bullet points or flames, and I would not be pulled into a ping-pong match where my time and sanity got spent like napkins at the table, so I opened the gallery. Selected the quiet little photo I took last Christmas of the itemized receipt with the total circled in pen alongside a note to myself that read never again by default, and I dropped it into the chat with a single line that did not ask permission and did not invite debate. Rotation starts now, names in order and no exceptions, and then, before the performance could resume, I added the simplest boundary I could come up with, one that even the most committed mind reader could not twist into something else, which was that every person would cover their own check unless it was their turn to host, and that I was not accepting cash pitches, delayed paybacks, or vague promises to settle later, because later is where accountability goes to die. Bree responded. First with the certainty of someone who has never actually tallied a bill, insisting that splitting evenly is more fair since we are family and family share, which is a beautiful sentiment when spoken by someone who orders modestly, tips properly, and reaches for their wallet without being prompted, but in our group has traditionally been code for please subsidize my extra rounds, and my appetizers, and my barely touched desserts, and while she typed that, my uncle chimed in with jokes about spreadsheets and audits, and my mother called me privately with that gentle voice she uses when she suspects I am about to do something that cannot be undone, telling me that pride can be a stubborn thing and that if I could just let this go we might have peace again. I told her that peace built on one person's silence is not peace, it is debt, and mine has been compounding for years, so I am paying it off differently now, and she went quiet in that way that tells me she feels the truth hitting, but does not yet know where to put it. And when we hung up, I returned to the thread to find Aunt Denise performing what she thinks is diplomacy, proposing that we revisit rotation after the new year because this is a terrible time to change traditions, and I answered with a calm that surprised even me, saying that the tradition is not generosity, the tradition is avoidance, and I am done avoiding, which is why I have set the order and I am not moving it. And then I listed the names with mine placed last because I wanted it crystal clear that this is not about control, it is about fairness, and I ended with a final line that I kept as plain as a road sign: if you call anyone an ATM, you take the next turn. Which is not a threat, it is a mirror, and if you do not like the reflection, then perhaps it is time to stop making those faces. The thread did that thing group threads do when a boundary lands, where a few people quietly like the message without saying anything because they agree but do not want to be the next target, while the usual chorus tries to spin or stall. And into that delicate pause slid a notification I did not expect but should have predicted, because nothing terrifies a small tyrant more than being told the house rules just changed. Aunt Denise removed you from family chat, a neat little pop-up that felt like being uninvited from a table I've been feeding for years, and almost immediately after that, a text from her directly that read, in a tone that wanted to sound maternal but missed by a mile, if you want rules, you will get rules. And you will regret this, which made me laugh in that quiet way you do when someone threatens you with consequences that are mostly their own reflection. I took a breath, put the phone face down, made coffee, and promised myself I would not spiral or plead or chase, because the entire point of this shift is that I do not chase people who only respect boundaries when they get something from them. And as I stirred the mug and felt the room settle around me, my screen lit up again, not with another rant or with my mother's voice, but with a name I did not expect and a message so clean and kind that it cut through the smoke like fresh air, because it came from the only person in this whole story who had treated me like a human being in the moment that mattered, Janelle, the server from last night, who somehow found my contact through the reservation and wrote a single line that did not pick a side but made one thing very clear: I see this all the time. You did the right thing. Separate checks save holidays. And if you ever need a reservation where the policy protects you, I can help, which told me two things at once: that the world outside my family still runs on basic fairness, and that my next move would not be rage or retreat, but something sturdier and smarter that would make freeloading structurally impossible. When the smoke from the group chat trial finally started to thin and the noise gave way to silence that was more about bruised egos than genuine reflection, I knew that if I let things drift back into the old rhythm, then by Easter we would be sitting at the same table with the same quiet expectations and the same little digs disguised as jokes. So I decided that before the next holiday rolled around, I would make the terms of my new reality unmistakably clear. I had been keeping every receipt for years, not because I was plotting revenge at the time, but because I have a habit of writing down expenses and sticking them in a thin envelope I kept tucked inside my laptop sleeve. And when I opened that envelope after the Christmas blow-up, the pile of faded slips and credit card statements told a story far louder than anything I could type in a group chat. Each piece of paper was its own quiet witness, proof that I had been funding not just dinners, but the illusion that generosity meant respect, and once I saw those numbers lined up in neat little rows, there was no turning back to the comforting lie that this was just tradition. So I asked my mother if I could stop by her house on a Saturday afternoon, and I made sure Aunt Denise and Bree were there too, because it had to be said to their faces and not behind screens where they could twist and deflect. When I walked in, the air was already tense, with Bree tapping away on her phone like she was preparing a statement, and Aunt Denise holding herself in that rigid way she does when she thinks confrontation is coming, but wants to look like she is above it. I carried nothing but a manila envelope and a small notebook, and when we sat down at the dining table, I placed them both in the center like evidence in a trial. My mother tried to make tea, tried to soften the edges, but I waved it off because I knew if I allowed her soothing voice to run the room, the hard part would slip away into polite half measures, and I was done with half measures. I opened the envelope and pulled out the receipts, not fanning them out dramatically, but laying them down calmly, one by one, until the table looked less like a family meeting and more like an audit. I explained, without raising my voice and without layering on blame, that these were the totals for the last several years of Christmas dinners, birthday gatherings, and other occasions, where the bill magically landed in front of me and everyone else shifted in their seats until I paid. I told them the numbers were not to shame them, not to demand repayment, but to show the reality of what had been quietly taken for granted. Bree rolled her eyes and muttered about keeping score, but I answered her directly, telling her that keeping score is not about punishing, it is about staying honest with yourself, because if I had not written it down, I would have continued to convince myself that it was not as bad as it felt. Aunt Denise leaned back with that smirk she uses like a weapon and said, "You buy respect with money and then complain when people expect it," and the words stung not because they were true, but because they revealed exactly how she had always framed me in her mind. Not as a niece, not as a person, but as a source of leverage. I took a breath, steadied myself, and said, "I do not buy respect, I subsidize convenience, and there is a difference." The silence after that stretched longer than I expected, long enough that I realized I finally had their full attention. That is when I pulled out the small notebook, opened to a clean page, and read the order I had written down: Aunt Denise, then Uncle Ray, then my mother, then Bree, and finally me. I told them this was the new rotation for holiday dinners, and that if someone could not host or cover their turn, then we would meet at a place where separate checks were guaranteed, because I was finished being the automatic solution. And then, because I wanted to make sure the insult I had overheard would never fade into the background as if it were just a slip of the tongue, I added a rule so simple and so sharp it left no room for argument. Anyone who calls another family member an ATM automatically moves to the top of the rotation for the next 3 gatherings. Bree scoffed, said it was childish, but I looked her in the eye and replied, "Childish is pretending grown adults cannot pay for their own food." My mother tried again to soften things, saying that this all felt too harsh, that families are supposed to give without keeping track, but I told her gently that giving only counts when it is a choice, and what I had been doing was not giving anymore, it was being used. And if she wanted to keep calling it generosity, she could, but I would not play along. Aunt Denise tapped her nails on the table, looked down at the notebook, and then leaned forward with that glint in her eyes that always precedes a challenge. She said, "About that penalty, you might want to get ready for Easter," and then stood up, leaving her teacup half full on the counter as if the conversation was already over. I gathered my papers, slid them back into the envelope, and told them I was not looking for their approval, only their acknowledgement that things had changed, and as I walked out, I heard Bree whisper something under her breath about me making this all about money. But I did not answer because I had already said everything I needed to say. For the first time, I was not the one leaving with the weight of everyone else's choices pressing down on me. Instead, I left with the clarity that the next move was not mine, and that whatever they did at Easter would only prove my point. And deep down, I already knew they would test me, because people who have lived off your silence for years never give it up without trying to break you back into the role that made their lives easier. But I had shown them the receipts, I had drawn the line, and I had written the rules in ink. Easter was coming, and this time, they would either face their own tab or face themselves. By the time Easter was creeping closer and the polite silences in our family group had turned into an awkward kind of truce, I knew perfectly well that if I left the logistics of the dinner to them, the old tricks would crawl right back into the evening. With missing wallets, exaggerated sighs, and whispered reminders that I was the one who could afford it, so I decided to make the setting itself unshakable, not by arguing anymore, but by making sure the structure of the evening had no gaps, where freeloading could slide in. I reached out to Janelle, the server who had backed me up on Christmas, because she had recently moved to a mid-range restaurant that offered pre-authorization for large groups, which meant that every single guest would have to put down a card before a single order hit the kitchen, and that tiny shift in policy was exactly the backbone I needed to stop this cycle dead in its tracks. When I booked the reservation, I explained that I wanted separate checks sent. individual pre-authorizations, and I asked for it in writing so there would be no confusion once we arrived, because I knew exactly how my Aunt Denise operated and how quickly she could spin any inconsistency into an excuse. On the night of the dinner, I showed up 10 minutes early, greeted Janelle at the door, and watched as she set up the table with a quiet professionalism that told me she had seen every family trick in the book. When my relatives arrived, they walked in with smiles stretched wider than usual, offering hugs that felt more like rehearsed performances than genuine affection, and within minutes Aunt Denise was making small comments about how nice it was to see everyone together without drama, a line so transparent that even my mother looked down at her napkin to avoid showing her reaction. The first test came quickly. As the menus were handed out, Aunt Denise announced that since we were family, we should just keep it simple and settle up at the end together, which was a thinly veiled attempt to steer things back to the old script. Before I even opened my mouth, Janelle stepped in with the smooth tone of someone who has rehearsed this line 100 times, explaining that the restaurant required a card from every guest up front to begin service for parties of our size, and that without it, no food or drinks could be entered into the system. The room shifted instantly. Bree made an exaggerated face and muttered about how humiliating it felt to be treated like she might skip out on the bill, while my uncle grumbled about corporate rules ruining tradition, but card by card, they all handed them over. Because there was no other choice if they wanted to eat, and for the first time in years, I watched as the responsibility shifted evenly across the table. I sat back, not gloating, not lecturing, simply letting the system do the work that my words had never been able to accomplish. My mother glanced at me more than once, half pleading for some kind of reassurance, but I kept my tone soft when I leaned toward her and said, "This is equal, nothing more, nothing less," and she nodded slowly, as if trying to accept it even while the old habits pulled at her. As the meal unfolded, I noticed subtle differences that were almost funny if they had not been so telling. My uncle, who usually ordered the most expensive cocktails without blinking, suddenly settled for a single beer. Bree skipped the second appetizer she normally ordered just for show, and even Aunt Denise studied the prices with a seriousness that made it clear she was not as indifferent to money as she had always pretended to be when I was the one footing the bill. Conversation stayed lighter than usual, though not without Barb's jokes about me being the family accountant, quips about how this felt like a seminar rather than a dinner, but none of it carried the sharp edge it used to. Because the safety net they had leaned on was gone, and without it, their voices held a nervous energy that they could not disguise. The turning point came at dessert, when the menus were placed on the table and Aunt Denise leaned in with that same glint she had shown at my mother's house weeks earlier, whispering just loud enough for everyone to hear, "You think you won, but watch this." I kept my face still, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction, but inside I felt that familiar wave of tension rise, because I knew her too well to dismiss that comment as empty. She had something planned, something she thought would put me back in my place, and the anticipation of it hung in the air even as she smiled sweetly and encouraged the kids to order whatever they wanted. When the checks finally arrived, split exactly as arranged, no one could slip out or pretend ignorance, and for the first time, I paid only for my meal without a trace of guilt. I signed my receipt, left a tip that felt like a gift to Janelle for being my silent partner in this war, and stood up with a calm I had not felt at a family holiday in years. Yet, even as I walked toward the door, I could hear Aunt Denise's laughter behind me, light and airy on the surface, but carrying that edge I had learned to recognize as the prelude to something calculated. She had accepted the rules of tonight because she had no choice, but she was already plotting the next move, convinced that she could twist the game back in her favor. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized I was not afraid of whatever she thought she had prepared, because the difference now was that I had finally built a system that did not depend on their goodwill, and once a system is in place, people can only fight it for so long before they either adjust or expose themselves. Still, her words echoed in my head all the way home. Watch this. I knew Easter might have ended, but the real test was coming, and it would not be about checks or cocktails anymore. It would be about whether I had the strength to take this all the way to the finish line, even if it meant tearing apart the fabric of our family dinners forever. By the time the echo of Aunt Denise's sing-song warning had faded and the quiet days between Easter and the next gathering stretched out like a tightrope I was learning to cross without looking down, I realized that if I ended this story with nothing more than separate checks and pre-authorizations, then I would only have built a fence around my own sanity without changing the ground the rest of them were standing on. So I spent those weeks doing something that felt both absolutely practical and quietly defiant, which was sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator and figuring out, in calm, clear strokes, how much I used to spend on these dinners each year, how much of that spending was habit rather than choice, and how much good it could do if I redirected it towards something that actually mattered to someone who had never once treated me like a walking cash machine. And the answer came faster than I expected, because the moment I let myself imagine building a bridge for someone instead of buying silence for everyone, the plan wrote itself, clean, simple, unarguable. I called the bank, I spoke with a counselor at the local community college, and I set up a small education fund in my niece's name with rules so straightforward that they felt like a breath of fresh air after years of tiptoeing around egos. And the rule at the center of the plan was as elegant as a compass, which was that every time the family gathered and everyone paid their own way or honored the rotation like adults, a deposit would go into the fund, and every time someone tried to pull the old pattern back into the room with guilt or tricks or whispered insults, the deposit would skip and the total would stand still, not out of spite, but out of absolute clarity that money should follow fairness, not enable entitlement. And when the paperwork was finished and the card with the account information arrived in a little white envelope, I sat for a long moment with it in my palm and felt something I had not felt since I started covering dinners all those years ago, which was the calm, unshowy certainty that I was doing something useful. When the next holiday rolled around and we found ourselves crowded around another long table, not fancy but pleasant enough and, more importantly, willing to honor the same infrastructure that had saved Easter from slipping into the past, I was ready for whatever twist Aunt Denise had been polishing in her mind since the last check hit the table, and I did not have to wait long because after the main course and the half-hearted banter about work and weather and the kind of TV everyone pretends to watch, she cleared her throat, looked straight at me with that stage-bright smile she uses when she is about to launch a performance, and announced that the rotation I insisted on was childish and the prepay policy was insulting and that real families do not nickel and dime each other. They rely on the person who can handle it to handle it, which she presented as tradition even though it was nothing more than convenience dressed up as sentiment, and as a few nods moved around the table like a small ripple, I felt my mouth open, then close, then open again, not because I was rattled, but because I wanted the words to land without heat, without theater, without any of the noise she was trying to summon. I stood up, I thanked everyone for coming, and I said, calmly and without edge, that she was right about one thing: real families should not nickel and dime each other, which is exactly why I had stopped doing a job that was never mine and started doing something better. And then I put a small envelope next to my niece's plate and explained, in the same even tone I would use for instructions on a new coffee maker, that I had opened a fund in her name at the community college, that I had already placed the first deposit that was roughly what I used to throw at appetizers and unclaimed desserts, and that every time we gathered and paid like adults or hosted in turn as agreed, another deposit would be made. And every time we tried to drag the old script back into the room, there would be no deposit, not as punishment, but as a mirror, because if the family truly believed in taking care of its own, then we could prove it by building something that outlived the check presenter. For a long breath, nothing moved, not the air, not the water glasses, not even the steady rustle of the servers making their rounds, and then my niece, who has always been more careful with her words than the rest of us, slid the envelope closer, opened it, and stared at the little card inside with a seriousness that made me want to cry in relief, while my mother covered her mouth with her fingers in that automatic gesture she has when she is moved and embarrassed at the same time, and my uncle made a joke that died in his throat before the punchline, and Bree, who had been rehearsing outrage for weeks, looked cornered by something that was not anger but proof. Because you cannot fling the word selfish at someone who has just redirected a tradition into an opportunity, not without showing your own reflection. Aunt Denise tried, of course she did. She shaped her mouth around a speech about manipulation and power plays, and how sad it was that I could not simply be generous without conditions, and I let her talk until the sentence wore itself out. Then I handed her a small card I had printed at home, simple font, black on white, and it read, in one line that fit like a key into the lock she kept rattling, in honor of your words, the ATM now invests in futures, not meals. And the expression that crossed her face was a storm and a surrender at the same time, because the beauty of a boundary tied to a benefit is that it exposes what people actually want, and if what they want is your silence, they will call your structure cruel. But if what they want is to be seen as good, they will eventually adjust to the structure to claim their piece of the credit. Checks arrived, separate and unremarkable, cards slid into little black folders without drama, tips were written with slightly more care than before, and as we stood to leave, my mother pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than a social gesture and whispered, in a voice that trembled with relief and apology, that she finally understood what I had been carrying all those years, and I told her it was over, not the family, not the holidays, but the confusion, because now the rules were so simple that even our worst habits could not pretend not to understand them. That night, as I set my phone on the nightstand and watched the screen blink with a final message from Aunt Denise that read, with less venom and more calculation than before, what happens if we skip the rotation, I typed the only answer that mattered. The one that held no anger and no loopholes. Then the fund skips a deposit, and I put the phone face down, turned out the light, and let the quiet settle around me like a promise kept, because this is what winning looks like when you are done paying for applause and ready to invest in something that actually grows. And if there is still noise tomorrow, that is fine, because the structure will answer it for me, one clean deposit at a time.